Okay, so this is one example of how you can have private enforcement, which is what we call ostracism or boycott, which is, look, I'm taking my ball and I don't want to play with you anymore. Right? And that works amazingly well for most people. Right? So the same thing goes for not just for cases like this, but so your employer's not happy with you. You're a jerk. So what does your employer say? What is your employer's big threat if you break his contract? You break your contract with him. You're fired. Right? And in general, even if you were caught doing something like stealing from the employer, unless it's like some enormous amount of money, normally your employer doesn't press charges. Normally, all that your employer does is fire you. And is that enough to convince most people that it is a bad idea to steal from their employer? Yeah, it's, again, some pencils, whatever. So in the case of pencils, there's actually an efficiency argument about why employers may even want you to be taking some pencils, which is that pencils are untaxed. Pencil income is untaxed. So when you go and get some office supplies from your employer, you go and print out your graphic novel on the employer printer. For example, we don't have a color printer, so I can't do that. But these are ways where an employer can actually funnel you some money that isn't taxed, and so in fact they may prefer to do this, right? Or when my wife worked at a law firm and they gave us an enormous number of free meals every year, which were never taxed. I think at least $10,000 per year worth of free meals, but according to a law firm, that is de minimis. That is, that is minimal. It's maybe more than a lot of people earn in a year, but still, it counts as minimal. But so in any case, these are that is a side issue. But in general, if you were to steal a substantial amount from your employer, substantial but not like hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably all that would happen is that you'd be fired. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, this is actually a case where private punishment could be much more severe in a different legal climate. Because right now, suppose that your employer fires you for stealing, and another employer calls the first employer up and says, "So, what do you think about Jeff Jones? Was he a good employee?" What right now is an employer likely to say when that call is made? When they receive that call, they're asked for a recommendation for a guy who was fired for stealing. What is an employer quite likely to say? Can't say anything, right? And that's that's something. And suppose that actually the guy that you really just want the problem to completely go away. Right? And if the guy is hired by somebody else, then he's definitely no longer your problem, right? A lot of times you'll say, "Oh, he's wonderful, he's great. Jeff Jones, go Jeff Jones, hire him." Okay, so this is something created in large part by the threat of lawsuits, because the employee might sue you for any number of reasons, and especially if he has a lot of trouble getting a new job because you're bad-mouthing him and he finds out about this, and you say, "Well, but it was all true." Still, you may wind up getting yourself into some legal trouble. So one way that you could wind up making the private sanctions more severe is if it were not illegal or not discouraged for employers to go and be honest about people. Right? So if actually there was no way for an employee to go and sue you for saying something that was true about him, right? Or in fact, suppose there were a binding arbitration clause saying, if you're fired, you can't sue me about it. Right? Or there's an arbitrator saying, in the event of a dispute about firing, the decision will be made by my brother-in-law. So and again, so I mean, when I talk about waiving your right to sue, the key point is effectively, giving full binding arbitration does amount to letting people waive the right to sue. Right? So you can kill several birds with one stone with that simple change. Okay, so ostracism and boycott is one option. Another one. If anyone has ever hired a contractor, and you may notice that they will advertise that they are licensed and blank, bonded. Right? What is bonding? It is basically a way to make sure that if there is a dispute, the person has money. Okay, so if there's a $50,000 bond, this means that if there is a decision against you for $50,000 or less, the money is there in an escrow account somewhere. So even if the person decides, "I don't feel like paying this," well, that doesn't really matter, because the arbitrator actually is authorized to disperse funds that are already there. Okay, so something else that can be done. Okay? And again, is it possible doing just what I said to fully privatized? Probably not. However, what I'm talking about here is, as I said, keyhole economics, keyhole surgery. Would it be possible to privatize a lot more enforcement using these techniques? And I think the answer is definitely yes. Okay. Now, what's kind of interesting about what I said is very often economists will say, "Look, it's absolutely clear government must have a monopoly over these things. At minimum, you got to have that." Now, you can argue about whether the minimal state is a good idea, but I think that what I've shown is definitely they're wrong. It is definitely true you don't have to have a monopoly of those things. How do we know we don't have to have a monopoly? Because we don't have a monopoly. We don't have a monopoly now. Right? We have, government right now is way beyond the night watchman state, and yet it doesn't actually do all the night watchman functions. there are many aspects of what we think of as being the minimal state that are not actually part of what government does right now. Hence the title of the talk, less than the minimum. Right? Yes, it's obviously you cannot literally have less than the minimum, right? But less than what people consider to be the minimum. Not only is it possible, it's already here right now, and once that is actually on the table, then I think it's easily possible to have a very reasonable discussion with someone about whether we could have more than we currently have. Right? And I think someone would have to be extremely dogmatic to say there's no way we could have one more security guard than we currently have. There's no way that we could give any more scope to private arbitration. All of these things, we could definitely give more scope to them than they currently have, which means that rather than being some crazy fringe idea, privatization of more of these things is something that any reasonable person should be willing to consider. Okay? Now, here's, of course, the hidden agenda. Like pull off the mask. All right, so pushing these insights further. Once you agree we could have more, how much more could we have? Well, as I said, I'm thinking about this in terms of keyhole surgery or keyhole economics. So what is the absolute minimum that we would have to have in order to solve whatever problems that you might think you'd have with full privatization? Okay. Well, here's what I'm thinking about. Once you privatize the easy-to-privatize functions, the minimal state, right? And what are those? Well, as I said, with police, anytime right now that you have police patrolling a neighborhood, that could be privatized. Right? Right now we have homeowners associations in some areas that do it. Right? So if police were simply to say, look, if there's a homeowners association, we don't patrol there. That's your concern. Or once they say, look, you got an apartment complex, that's the concern of you in order to patrol that area. Right? Not only would this greatly reduce the amount that police currently do, it would also change incentives for future development. So that in the future, more homeowner associations would actually be set up for new developments that would actually already be providing the services. Okay, so it's quite clear that that as we speak, that right now the role of police could be greatly expanded. Similarly, the courts, as I said, really, if you were to just have courts give complete deference to binding arbitration agreements, right? So in other words, if you were to go before a public court and the judge were to say, "Show me the contract," and he says, "Is there a binding arbitration contract in here or binding arbitration clause?" If the plaintiff says, "Yes," if the judge were to say, "All right, well, everything seems to be in order. Tough luck." If that were the response of every judge in this country to a case that was brought before them involving a contract that had a binding arbitration clause, the role of arbitration would vastly expand. Right? And I don't think that one can seriously argue about this, because clearly there are right now there are a lot of lawsuits that people would like to make cheaper than they currently are. Right now a lot of business is run around the threat of lawsuits, and if you could go and sign a contract with whoever might sue you, saying that we were going to handle this outside of the courts, virtually everyone would do this. Yes. Mm-hmm. We think about most of our disputes, we don't have a contract with somebody that at this time. Somebody steals my watch. Right. We didn't have a contract about that. How would you deal with that aspect? Right. So again, so far I'm just saying what would be very easy to do. Although even there, what I suggested is you could go before a public court, and the public court says, okay, do you have a binding arbitration clause? No. Okay. Well, in that case, go over to the room over there. You're going to see a list of possible arbitrators for handling this case. You have to choose somebody. You can't cross every name off the list, but that's how it's going to be handled. Okay, so now again, there's a bigger problem with enforcement, because you have someone who's stealing wallets. There may be an issue with whether he's probably not bonded already. Okay, so he is likely that he's not already able to. He hasn't already set up an account where you can easily get compensated for. But in that case, we will be dealing with that momentarily. So deal with that there. Okay, so once you privatize the easy-to-privatize functions of the minimal state, what about the harder functions? Okay, and this is where you have to start scaring people. Right, so eventually you have to do it. Right, eventually you have to do it. Eventually we have moved beyond the realm of something that is just a common sense extension of what we already have into something that makes people uncomfortable, which again may mean that you're just wrong. On the other hand, it may mean that they're closed-minded and should consider something more extreme. Okay, so what are some things that could be what does a more extreme privatization amount to? Well, it amounts to saying things like, for example, a private court can rule that someone is going to have to go to a private prison to work off their debt. Okay, so indentured servitude. Yes, now that's something that will sound crazy to most people. Although again, why is it that indentured servitude for someone who stole your watch is such a crazy idea? I don't know why it's so cruel. Why do people think it's so awful? It's like it would be a person who'd have to be who would be deprived of his freedom because of what he did, like what we do right now. Right? Only there would be some compensation being paid to the victim of the crime. Okay? So again, when you're thinking about more extreme cases, I mean, basically, so when is it that something more extreme is required? Well, basically, if you've got something where there's a dispute between strangers and the defendant and there's no easy way to make the defendant pay, this is where indentured servitude or something along those lines is pretty much all that we have left. But of course, right now, what do we do in situations where someone commits a crime and they're basically unable to pay for it? Right? Someone does something to a stranger, they have no contract, and they also have they have very few assets. What do we do to them right now? Yeah, we put them in jail right now. Right? So this is basically saying that you could have a private version of the same thing, which obviously makes people very uncomfortable. Again, now if you imagine what the system would look like once it existed for a while, it would probably wind up looking a lot like auto insurance. Right? Except it would be protection insurance, where you have a contract with a protection agency, and if in the event of a dispute, you call them up, they call up, so you say someone did something to you, you call up your agency, they call up the agency of the person that you say did something to you, and then they would have their own procedures for handling that dispute and figuring out what's done. But I think actually someone else will be talking about this in more detail, so I won't get into it in greater depth. But see, now here's actually another interesting case. So when people start thinking about privatizing police, they often start freaking out about what are we going to do? What if these police agencies go rogue and start killing people and attacking them? Last week, I heard John Hosnas give a name to a intermediate proposal of how to deal with this. So he called this the remedial state. He said, look, here's what we do. We privatize the police, but the government keeps the army. And if any police agency starts running around killing people, the army takes care of them. Other than that, it's a free market. Okay, so that is, again, an intermediate step, and I would say that definitely does handle many of the most fearful objections that people have, like the police agencies will basically will be outlaws and bandits or the mafia. Well, if that really is your concern, this is not a good argument against privatizing the police. It may be an argument for having the central government keep the army so that they can say, hey, look, if anyone starts doing any of these crazy things that people are worried about, the army will take care of that. Okay. All right. So basically what I'm asking you is how far can you privatize before you are convinced that it will lead to disaster? How far can you go? Right? We can definitely go further than we currently have. How much further? I don't know. What do you think? Right. So what are some cases where you think it would just be crazy for the market to do this? It would lead to disaster. And what's the disaster? So everyone convinced that this would be a great idea and would have no problem at all? Yes. Or actually, how about someone else?
You have multiple governments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Private governments,
Mm-hmm.
and then if one is more powerful than the other, why would that one decide to overpower the other?
Mm-hmm. Right. So if that were your concern, the keyhole economic solution to that would be what I was saying. Well, the central government keeps the army. So if a bigger agency starts attacking a smaller agency, the army says, "Hey, look, we're even bigger than you are." So there's little fish, medium fish, and then the big fish is the central government. And if medium fish starts trying to eat little fish, the big fish can say, "Hey, I know what you're doing. Don't try it because we have a lot more soldiers working for us than you have for you." Okay, so that is a much smaller change from, or that is a much smaller role for government than most people can even imagine. But yes.
What about a dispute between two impoverished people who don't have any?
Dispute between two impoverished people who don't have any insurance. Their simple solution is the court says binding arbitration, and part of the binding arbitration is you have to work out the person who's found guilty has to work out a payment plan. Okay, so and if you break your payment plan, then we put you in jail. Okay, so this is much less than what government does right now. Right now, of course, you're found guilty of a crime, the government puts you in jail. This is a case where the government would only put you in jail if you're found guilty of a crime by an arbitrator and you don't work out a payment plan that's satisfactory to the plaintiff. Okay, so this would mean that most people would rather work out a payment plan than go to jail. So basically, if you keep the jail in the background, so that's the place where we send you if everything else fails. That would be a much smaller role for government than currently exists.